It's over, Amara. Sign the papers.
If it keeps you alive, I'll sign. Losing me wasn't your mistake.
Woman standing between you and your grave.
What did you just say?
Every lie you blamed her for, she told to keep you alive.
Keep you alive. Tell me, where is my wife?
You looked your wife in the eyes.
You're telling me the woman I called a traitor was protect me?
She let you hate her because she couldn't bear to watch you die.
In Seoul's most feared empire, bullets were rarely the real danger. Silence was. Kang Ji-hoon had buried men for lying to his face, yet the woman sitting across from him tonight, the one he was about to erase from his life forever, was hiding the one secret that could save him. If you believe loyalty deserves the truth before judgment, hit subscribe right now. Like this video if you think Ji-hoon is about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Only the doubters, the quick to judge, and the secret villains in your own life won't share this one. The Cheongdam Hotel did not do subtlety. Gold trim wrapped around every doorframe like the building itself was bragging, and the chandeliers hung so low over the private dining room that a shorter man might have needed a helmet. Kang Ji-hoon sat beneath one of them now, perfectly still, the kind of stillness that made waiters suddenly remember urgent business in the kitchen. Across the table sat his wife, Amara Whitmore, in a black dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent and looked like it knew it. 4 years of marriage had taught her exactly how to read this man, and right now, every signal pointed to disaster. His jaw was tight. His hands were folded. His eyes carried the particular blankness of a man who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up to his pride. He slid a folder across the table.
No speech.
No explanation. Just the quiet slap of paper against white linen, the way a man might drop a receipt after an expensive, disappointing dinner. Divorce papers. Amara looked down at them, then back up at her husband, and let out a laugh that had absolutely no humor in it. In case you're wondering, that particular sound is what heartbreak makes when it's trying very hard to stay composed in front of witnesses. No goodbye speech, she asked. No dramatic monologue? I thought Mafia bosses lived for a good monologue. I don't owe you a performance, Ji-hoon said, and there it was, the voice that made grown men in his organization suddenly find their shoes fascinating. I owe you the truth. You changed. You lied. You disappeared into secrets you thought I would notice. She could have argued. She could have told him everything right there under the world's most judgmental chandelier, could have handed him the truth like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Instead, she picked up the pen. Because here's the thing about loving a dangerous man. Sometimes protecting him means letting him hate you for the wrong reason instead of loving him and watching him die for the right one. She signed her name in one smooth, unhurried line, the kind of signature you give when you've already decided the fight isn't worth having in public. Then she smiled at him, a small, devastating thing, the kind of smile that says I could burn your entire world down right now, but I'd rather save you from the fire. Ji-hoon watched the ink dry and told himself this was relief. His chest disagreed violently. Somewhere behind his ribs, something that felt suspiciously like his heart was staging a full protest, but a man who ran an empire built on nerve did not, under any circumstances, let his face admit that. By morning, the entire organization knew. Lieutenants who had never once questioned a shipment schedule suddenly had a great deal to say about Amara's character over coffee they weren't drinking fast enough to avoid eavesdroppers. Rival families, always eager for a reason to feel superior, sent gift baskets stuffed with fruit and just enough passive aggression to qualify as an insult. One card simply read, "Congratulations on your freedom," which in Mafia language translates roughly to, "We've been waiting years for this." Everyone had a theory, an affair, a betrayal. Some secret phone call Ji-hoon overheard 8 months earlier, a hushed conversation in a language of half-sentences and long silences that had planted a seed of suspicion he'd been watering with resentment ever since. He had built an empire on trusting absolutely no one, and somehow, impossibly, he had let one woman all the way past the gate. Now the gate was closing again, paper signed. The woman he'd once have burned a city down for walking out with her head high and her secrets sealed tighter than the vault beneath his own house. What he didn't know, What none of them knew was that 4 hours from now his phone would ring, his mother's voice would order him into a car before he could argue, and an old wooden box locked since before he was born would crack his entire world open like an egg. He thought he was ending a marriage. He had no idea he was about to start a war. Grief, Ji-hoon discovered, was inconvenient. It did not care that he had a shipment crossing the Busan port at midnight or that 3 of his lieutenants were currently pretending not to stare at him like he was a wounded animal that might snap. Grief simply sat in his chest like an uninvited guest, refusing to leave, refusing to explain itself, drinking all his good whiskey and judging his life choices. He told himself the papers changed nothing. He had a business to run, an empire built on precision and fear in roughly equal measure, and a woman signing her name on a document was not going to derail a man who had once negotiated a truce with 3 separate crime families over a single dinner. And yet here he was, standing at the window of his penthouse at 2 in the morning, staring at the city lights and thinking about the exact shade of Amara's smile when she'd signed away for years of marriage like she was tipping a waiter. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, which for a man in his profession usually meant trouble, blackmail, or his mother. It was his mother. "Come to the house," Madame Han said, and there was no morning wish, no pleasantry, no acknowledgement that it was the middle of the night. Madame Han did not believe in wasting words on people who already knew better than to argue with her. "Now?" Ji-hoon asked, mostly out of habit because he already knew the answer. "You are already in the car," she said, and hung up. He was, annoyingly, already in the car. His mother had a talent for being right about things before they'd finished happening, a skill Ji-hoon suspected she'd honed over decades of outmaneuvering men far more dangerous than her own son. If there was one person in Seoul more feared than Kang Ji-hoon, it was the small, silver-haired woman who had raised him, and the fact that she'd summoned him at 2 in the morning meant something had shifted in the universe that even she couldn't ignore. The family estate sat outside the city, tucked behind gates that had seen more blood than most battlefields, though you wouldn't know it from the immaculate hedges and the koi pond that Madame Han tended personally, because apparently even ruthless matriarchs needed a hobby that didn't involve destroying people. She was waiting in the study when he arrived, seated in her usual chair with the posture of a woman who had never once in her life slouched, a wooden box resting on her lap like she was cradling something both precious and radioactive. The box was old, its edges worn smooth, its lock the kind of antique brass that had clearly not been opened in decades. "Sit down," she said. Ji-hoon sat because some instincts you never outgrow, and staring at your mother's specific tone of voice like it might detonate was one of them. "You signed the papers," she said. It was not a question. "You heard." "I hear everything. It is why people are afraid of me and only respectful of you." She said this with the casual cruelty of a woman who loved her son enough to insult him directly to his face. "Do you know why your wife stopped sleeping properly 2 years ago? Why she started disappearing for hours at a time and coming home smelling like other people's cigarettes and secrets? She was lying to me. She was protecting you," Madame Han said, "from something I buried before you were even born, and something I was too much of a coward to dig back up myself." She opened the box. The hinges groaned like they resented being disturbed after so many years of peaceful darkness. Inside, Ji-hoon saw envelopes yellowed with age, photographs curling at the corners, and a single folded letter sealed with wax that had cracked from decades of neglect. His mother lifted the letter with the reverence of a woman handling something that might still bite. "This is your father's handwriting," she said, and for the first time in Ji-hoon's entire life, he heard something in his mother's voice that sounded dangerously close to fear. He took the letter. His father had been dead 12 years, buried with more ceremony than most kings, remembered by the organization as a man of ruthless brilliance and terrifying calm. Ji-hoon unfolded the paper with hands that were, infuriatingly, not entirely steady. The first line alone made his stomach drop somewhere near his shoes. "By the boy's 30th birthday, the debt will be repaid, in blood or in marriage, whichever the Yoon family prefers." Ji-hoon looked up at his mother. "What debt?" Madame Han's expression did something he had never once seen it do in 33 years. It softened, and then it broke. "Sit back down," she said quietly. This is going to take a while, and you are going to hate every single word of it. The debt, as it turned out, was not a metaphor. Ji-hoon had grown up in a world where men used the word debt the way other families use the word please, a polite little cover for something far more sinister underneath. But this debt was literal, decades old, and apparently patient enough to survive his father's death, his own childhood, and an entire marriage without once announcing itself. "Your father made an enemy before you were born," Madame Han said, setting the letter aside like it was something that might reach out and grab her if she held it too long. "A man named Yoon Tae-sik. They were partners once, before your father decided partnership was inefficient and betrayal was more profitable." Ji-hoon leaned forward. "Father built the empire on betrayal?" "Your father built the empire on being smarter than everyone he ever worked with," Madame Han said, with a particular pride of a woman who had loved a dangerous man and never once pretended otherwise. Yoon Tae-sik lost everything. His territory, his men, his reputation. He swore revenge, the kind that doesn't fade with a good night's sleep or a decade of quiet. "So, he came for father." "He came for you," she corrected. "Your father struck a bargain to buy peace. When you turned 30, the Yoon family would collect. Either your life, ended quietly and without further trouble to anyone, or your marriage, into their bloodline, sealing the debt with a wedding instead of a funeral." Ji-hoon sat very still, the kind of stillness he usually reserved for enemies, except now the enemy was a piece of paper written by a man who'd been dead for 12 years and apparently hadn't finished ruining his son's life yet. "I turned 32 years ago," he said slowly. "I know. Nothing happened." "Something happened," Madame Han said. "You simply weren't paying attention, because you were too busy accusing your wife of an affair to notice. She was the one holding the wolves back from your door." The room went very quiet. Somewhere outside, the koi pond made its soft, indifferent water sounds, entirely unbothered by the fact that a man's entire understanding of his marriage was currently collapsing in real time. "Explain," Ji-hoon said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. Madame Han pulled a photograph from the box, sliding it across the table like she was dealing a card in a game only she understood the rules to. It showed Amara, 2 years younger, standing in a dim restaurant with a man Ji-hoon did not recognize, her expression unreadable, her posture the careful stillness of someone negotiating for something far more important than dinner. "That is Yoon Tae-sik's son," Madame Han said. "Yoon Ha-rin. He inherited his father's grudge along with his father's territory. Your wife found the letter 2 years ago, hidden in this house during a family gathering you were too drunk on your own success to remember clearly. She never told you. Instead, she went to Ha-rin herself." "Why would she do that instead of telling me?" Madame Han's laugh was short and humorless. "Because she knows you, Ji-hoon. She knew that if you found out, you would go to war, and men die in wars, sometimes the ones fighting them, and sometimes the ones simply standing too close. She traded pieces of herself, favors, secrets, silence, anything she could offer that wasn't your life, to buy you time without ever letting you know you needed it." Ji-hoon thought of every late night he'd cataloged as evidence against her. Every unexplained absence, every hushed phone call cut short the second he entered a room, every time he'd told himself she was becoming a stranger under his own roof. He had built an entire case for betrayal out of a woman quietly bleeding to keep him alive. "The late-night calls," he said. "The disappearing. All of it was her negotiating with the son of a man who wants me dead." "Yes. And I signed divorce papers." "Yes," Madame Han said again. And this time there was no softness in it at all, only the blunt, merciless honesty of a mother who loved her son too much to let him wallow in his own stupidity without saying so out loud. "You threw away the one person willing to bleed quietly for you, over a misunderstanding you never once thought to ask her about directly." Ji-hoon stood so fast the chair scraped against marble like a scream. "Where is she now?" Madame Han's expression shifted again, and this time it was something closer to dread. "That," she said, "is the part you are not going to like." "What do you mean, that's the part I'm not going to like?" Ji-hoon's voice had dropped into the register his enforcers called the countdown voice, the tone that usually preceded someone losing a limb or a life. His mother, to her credit, did not flinch. Madame Han had survived 30 years of marriage to a man far more terrifying than her son currently pretended to be, and mild threats from her own child registered somewhere between background noise and mild inconvenience. "Sit down," she said, "and I will tell you, though I suspect you'll want to break something afterward, so perhaps move the good vases first." Ji-hoon did not sit. He stood by the window instead, arms crossed, jaw working like he was chewing on his own temper to keep it from escaping. Madame Han sighed the sigh of a woman who had raised a son with excellent instincts for violence and absolutely none for patience. 2 hours after she left her dinner tonight, Madame Han said, "Amara came here." That stopped him cold. "Here? Why would she come to you?" "You've never exactly hidden your opinion of our marriage." "Because I was the only person who might understand what she was carrying," Madame Han said, and for a moment something old and tired passed over her face, the look of a woman who had also once carried a burden alone to protect a man she loved. "She told me everything. The letter she found. The 2 years of negotiations with Harin. The debt she'd been quietly dismantling piece by piece while you accused her of destroying your marriage instead. And you knew all of this," Ji-hoon said, "and you let me sign those papers anyway?" "I did not know until tonight," Madame Han snapped, with enough heat that Ji-hoon actually took a half step back, old habits dying hard. "Your wife has spent 2 years protecting the two of us from a debt your own father buried, and she did it so well that even I, a woman who notices everything, did not see it until she sat across from me shaking and finally let herself stop being strong for 5 minutes. Ji-hoon's throat tightened around something he refused to name. "Where is she, mother?" Madame Han hesitated, and hesitation from Madame Han was rarer than snow in July. "She told me she was done. Done protecting a man who couldn't be bothered to ask her a single honest question in 2 years. Done bleeding quietly for a family that repaid her sacrifice with divorce papers. She said she was leaving the country tonight, on a flight to somewhere she refused to name, and she asked me not to tell you until it was too late to matter." "Then why are you telling me now?" "Because," Madame Han said, standing slowly, every inch of her radiating the quiet authority that had kept an empire's second-in-command in check for 3 decades, "I am a great many terrible things, Ji-hoon, but I am not a woman who watches her son destroy his own happiness twice in one lifetime and calls it discipline. Your father made this mess. Amara cleaned it up in silence. You are going to fix it, tonight, or you'll spend the rest of your life running an empire that means absolutely nothing without her in it." Ji-hoon pulled out his phone. 3 missed calls from his head of security, 2 texts marked urgent, and absolutely nothing from Amara, because of course there wasn't, because the woman had apparently decided that disappearing quietly was easier than watching him choose wrong twice.
"Her flight," he said.
"When?" Madame Han checked her watch with the calm precision of a woman who had already done this math an hour ago and was simply waiting for him to catch up. 90 minutes. Incheon. Gate unknown, because your wife is smarter than both of us and covered her tracks the way she's been doing for 2 years. Ji-hoon was already moving, code in hand, keys jingling with the frantic energy of a man who had spent his entire adult life being unhurried and was now discovering what actual urgency felt like. 90 minutes to cross the city in traffic. That's impossible. "Then it's a good thing," Madame Han said, following him toward the door with a speed that suggested she had zero intention of missing this particular disaster unfold, "that you run an organization with helicopters, several extremely fast cars, and at least a dozen men who owe you favors large enough to get you through airport security without a ticket." For the first time in hours, something that might have been hope flickered across Ji-hoon's face. "You're coming with me?" "I buried a debt your father made and let it fester for 30 years, Madame Han said, climbing into the car before her son could argue about the logistics of a woman her age riding in what amounted to a rolling weapon. "The least I can do is help you unbury the woman who paid for my silence with 2 years of her own peace." As the car tore through the sleeping streets of Seoul, gates opening like the entire city had received advance notice not to get in Kong Ji-hoon's way tonight, he found himself thinking of every conversation he'd twisted into evidence, Every late-night phone call he'd treated as a confession instead of asking the one question that might have saved them both 2 years of silent suffering. Are you okay? For simple words he had never once thought to ask the woman bleeding quietly in his own house. Somewhere ahead, at a gate he didn't yet know the number of, Amara Whitmore was boarding a flight designed to erase her from a life that had never once made her feel safe enough to be honest. Ji-hoon intended to make sure that flight never took off. Incheon International Airport at 4 in the morning was a strange kind of quiet, the sort of silence that belonged to a building built for chaos and momentarily forgetting its purpose. Cleaning crews moved in slow, tired circles. A handful of red-eye passengers dozed against pillars. And somewhere inside that hush, Amara Whitmore sat at gate 47 with a boarding pass in her hand and a decision in her chest that felt less like freedom and more like amputation. She had told herself on the drive over that this was the smart choice. The only choice, really, for a woman who had spent 2 years trading pieces of her own peace to keep a man alive who had repaid her with a folder full of legal paperwork and a face that hadn't so much as flickered when he handed it to her. She had rehearsed this moment in her head a dozen times on the way to the airport, imagining herself calm, composed, dry-eyed, and done. Instead, she sat gripping a paper cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking, watching the clock tick toward boarding with a specific dread of someone waiting for an execution she had scheduled herself. She did not notice the man in the dark coat until he was 3 seats away. "You weren't at the gate 2 minutes ago," Amara said without looking up because she recognized the particular quality of that silence, the kind that only followed her husband into a room like a loyal, terrifying pet. "How did you even get through security without a ticket?" "I own the airline's biggest shipping contract," Ji-hoon said, sitting down beside her with none of the composure he usually wore like armor. His hair was a mess. His coat was buttoned wrong. He looked, for possibly the first time in his adult life, like a man who had left the house without checking a mirror, which for Kong Ji-hoon was roughly equivalent to running through the streets on fire. "Turns out that buys you a great deal of goodwill with gate agents." "Convenient," Amara said, and stood, gathering her bag with hands that were not nearly as steady as she wanted them to be. "You can go home now, Ji-hoon. We signed papers. You don't have to chase down loose ends. You're not a loose end." His voice cracked on the last word, an unfamiliar sound coming from a man whose voice had never once cracked in 4 years of marriage, not during raids, not during betrayals, not even the night a rival family had put a bounty on his head with more zeros than most people's mortgages. "My mother told me everything. The letter.
The debt.
2 years of you sitting across a table from Yoon Harin, trading God knows what to keep the wolves off my back, while I sat at home cataloging your absences like evidence in a trial you didn't even know you were on." Amara's jaw tightened. "So now you know. Congratulations. Doesn't change anything. You already decided I was the villain in this story, and I'm tired, Ji-hoon. I'm tired of loving a man who trusts everyone at gunpoint except the woman sleeping next to him." "You're right," Ji-hoon said, and the admission seemed to cost him something physical, like each word was being surgically removed without anesthesia. "I spent 2 years assuming the worst because it was easier than asking you a direct question and risking an answer I couldn't control. That's not love. That's cowardice, wearing a very expensive suit." A voice overhead announced final boarding for a flight to somewhere Ji-hoon deliberately did not let himself hear, because hearing it made it real, made it a countdown instead of an abstract threat. Amara's eyes flicked toward the gate, then back to him, and for one terrible second Ji-hoon was certain she was going to walk through those doors and let the automatic glass swallow her whole. "That's me," she said quietly. "Don't. Give me one good reason." "Because I love you," Ji-hoon said, loud enough that the sleepy passengers nearby actually stirred, loud enough that 4 years of carefully maintained composure cracked wide open in the middle of an airport terminal at 4 in the morning, which was, admittedly, not the venue either of them had ever imagined for this particular confession. "Because you spent 2 years bleeding quietly to keep a debt my own father made from ending my life, and I repaid that with a folder of legal paperwork instead of a single honest conversation. Because the empire, the money, the whole ridiculous kingdom my family built on fear, none of it means anything if you're not the one standing next to me while I run it. Amara's composure, the thing she had built so carefully over the last few hours, wobbled dangerously. You threw me away. I know. In front of your entire organization. In front of rivals who sent fruit baskets celebrating my humiliation. I know, Ji-hoon said again, closing the distance between them slowly, the way you'd approach something wounded and unpredictable. And if you get on that plane, I will let you go, because you have spent 2 years sacrificing your own peace for mine, and you deserve to choose your life without me standing in the way of it one more time. But I am begging you, Amara, choose it with me instead of me. For a long moment, the airport held its breath along with both of them. Somewhere behind Amara, the gate agent called the final boarding announcement a second time, her voice bright and utterly indifferent to the fact that she was narrating the climax of someone else's entire life. There's something else, Amara said finally, her voice low. Something Madame Han might not have told you, because I only found out myself 3 days ago. Ji-hoon's stomach dropped.
What?
Yoon-haran isn't just your father's old rival son. Amara took a breath, the kind you take before handing someone a grenade you've been carrying alone for far too long. He's your mother's brother. Her half-brother, from a relationship she buried before she ever married your father. He didn't inherit the grudge from his father, Ji-hoon. He inherited it from a family secret your mother has been running from for 30 years, and he's been using it to bleed both families dry ever since he found out. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ji-hoon had ever heard. That's not possible, he said, though even as the words left his mouth he could feel the shape of the truth settling into place, an ugly, inevitable puzzle piece clicking into a picture he'd never wanted to see completed. His mother's fear when she'd opened that box. Her insistence on coming with him tonight instead of staying safely home. The particular tremor in her voice when she'd said this debt was one she'd been too much of a coward to dig up herself. Ask her, Amara said. If you don't believe me, ask the woman who sent you chasing me through an airport at 4 in the morning instead of telling you the whole truth herself. Behind them, at the edge of the terminal, Madame Han stood very still, her face pale under the fluorescent lights, and for the first time in Ji-hoon's entire life, his mother looked like a woman who had finally run out of places to hide. Madame Han did not move for a long moment, and in a family built on power plays and split-second decisions, that hesitation said more than any confession could have. Ji-hoon turned slowly to face his mother, his voice dropping to the low, dangerous register that had once made an entire rival syndicate reconsider a shipment route without a single shot fired. Tell me she's lying, he said. Madame Han's chin lifted, old habits of pride refusing to die even now, even here, even with her son's entire understanding of his family cracking open in the middle of an airport terminal at 4 in the morning. I am not going to stand in a public airport and discuss 30 years of buried history. You'll discuss it right here, Ji-hoon said, or you can explain to me later why I found out from Interpol instead of my own mother. A young security guard, drawn by the rising tension, began drifting toward them with the cautious energy of someone who sensed trouble but had absolutely no idea he was about to interrupt a Mafia family's entire emotional reckoning. Amara caught his eye and gave him a small, apologetic smile, the universal signal for family drama, please look away, and the guard, wisely, found something urgent to inspect on the other side of the terminal. Madame Han exhaled. And for the first time since Ji-hoon could remember, his mother looked her age. Not powerful, not immovable, simply tired, the way a person gets after carrying something heavy for so long their body has forgotten what it feels like to set it down. Before I married your father, she said quietly, I was engaged to another man. A merchant's son with no interest in this world, no interest in power, no interest in anything except making me laugh, which at the time felt like the most dangerous thing anyone had ever offered me. She paused, her eyes distant, seeing a version of soul that existed decades before her son was born. My own father disapproved. He wanted an alliance, not a love match, and when I refused to end things quietly, he arranged for the merchant's son to disappear from my life permanently. I never knew if he was killed or simply paid to vanish, and for 30 years I told myself it didn't matter which. And the son, Ji-hoon said slowly. Haran. I did not know he existed until 11 years ago, Madame Han said, and her voice, for the first time in Ji-hoon's entire life, trembled. A boy conceived before I was forced into marriage with your father, raised by a family that told him his mother had abandoned him for wealth and status. He grew up hating a version of me that was mostly fiction, and when he finally found out the truth, that I had been the one who was taken from him, not the one who left, it was too late to matter. Rage doesn't care about nuance, Ji-hoon. It only cares about a target. So, he attached himself to father's old rival. Ji-hoon said, the pieces sliding into place with the sick clarity of a puzzle nobody wanted finished. Used the Yoon name, used a decades-old business grudge as cover, and built himself a legitimate reason to come after this family, without anyone realizing the real war was personal, not political. Yes, Madame Han said. And when Amara found father's letter, Ji-hoon continued, turning to look at his wife, who stood watching this unraveling with the particular stillness of a woman who had already lived through this revelation once and was now simply waiting to see if her husband could survive it too. She didn't just find a rival family's blood debt. She found your brother. I told her everything 3 days ago when she finally confronted me directly instead of continuing to bleed silently the way she'd been doing for 2 years, Madame Han said. I begged her not to tell you until I found the courage to do it myself. I've spent 30 years being terrified of a truth I created by staying silent the first time, and I let that fear cost your wife 2 years of secret negotiations, sleepless nights, and now nearly her entire marriage. Ji-hoon felt something in his chest that was equal parts fury and grief, the specific, complicated ache of loving someone who had made an unforgivable mistake for understandable reasons. You let me accuse her of an affair. You let me sign divorce papers. You let all of this happen because you couldn't face your own past. Yes, Madame Han said, without excuse, without deflection, the single word landing with more honesty than Ji-hoon had heard from his mother in years. And I am telling you now, in front of the woman who paid for my cowardice with 2 years of her own peace, that I am done letting fear make decisions for this family. Haran does not want money. He does not want territory. He wants acknowledgement, Ji-hoon. The one thing none of us were brave enough to give him. He wants a mother, Amara said quietly, and the words landed in the terminal like something fragile finally, being set down after being carried too long. That's what this was always about. Not a debt. Not revenge for a business betrayal that happened before either of you were born. A son who spent 30 years believing his own mother chose an empire over him. Madame Han's composure, the thing she had spent decades building brick by brick into an impenetrable wall, finally cracked. I did not choose the empire. The empire was chosen for me, the same way it was chosen for my son, the same way we have all spent generations pretending we had control over lives that were decided before we were even born. The gate behind them had gone quiet. The flight to nowhere Amara had booked long since closed and departed without her, though nobody in the small, devastated circle of family had noticed the exact moment it happened. Ji-hoon reached for Amara's hand, and to his relief, to something that felt suspiciously like his ribs finally unclenching after hours of holding a breath he hadn't realized he was taking, she let him take it. I am done letting silence run this family, he said, looking between his mother and his wife, 2 women who had each carried enormous weight alone because they loved him too much to let him carry it with them. We're going to find Haran. Not with soldiers, not with threats, not with the kind of conversation this family usually has when someone crosses us. He looked at his mother, and something in his expression softened despite everything. 30 years of complicated love refusing to disappear just because the truth had finally surfaced. We're going to sit him down and give him what he actually wants. The truth. An apology that's 30 years overdue. And maybe, if he's willing, a family instead of a war. Madame Han's eyes glistened, though a woman like her would rather have walked into traffic than let an actual tear fall in public. He will not trust us easily. Good, Ji-hoon said. That means he's smarter than I gave him credit for. Amara squeezed his hand, and for the first time since the divorce papers had landed on that table beneath the Cheongdam Hotel's judgmental chandeliers, something that felt dangerously close to hope settled over the 3 of them. The war wasn't over. But for the first time in 30 years, the Kong family was finally choosing to fight it with the truth instead of another layer of silence. Yoon Harin agreed to the meeting on one condition. No guards, no soldiers, no lawyers dressed up as advisors with concealed weapons under their tailored jackets. Just family, he said, in a voice over the phone that managed to sound both amused and exhausted, like a man who had spent 30 years preparing for a war and was mildly disappointed to be offered a conversation instead. They met at a small tea house on the outskirts of Seoul, the kind of place with paper screens and low tables and absolutely no chandeliers, which Ji-hoon suspected was Harin's quiet way of establishing that this conversation would not be conducted on anyone's usual battlefield. Madame Han arrived first, seated with a stillness that fooled no one who knew her well enough to see the tension in her folded hands. Ji-hoon and Amara followed, arriving together, her fingers laced through his the entire walk from the car, a small, deliberate reminder to anyone watching that whatever else had broken in this family, that particular piece had already been mended. Harin was younger than Ji-hoon had imagined, though the eyes gave him away, the same sharp, assessing gaze Madame Han wore whenever she was deciding how much of the truth a person deserved to hear. He sat across the low table with the posture of a man who had rehearsed this meeting 1,000 times in his head and was still, despite all that preparation, visibly unsteady now that it was actually happening. "You look like her," he said to Ji-hoon, without preamble, without the polite opening lines this world usually demanded before anyone got to the truth. "I used to have a photograph. My adopted family burned it eventually, said it was better if I stopped looking for a resemblance in a woman who'd abandoned me." Madame Han flinched like she'd been struck. "I did not abandon you. I know that now," Harin said. 3 days ago, actually, when your daughter-in-law sat across from me in a restaurant and told me the truth instead of another negotiation, and I have spent every hour since trying to decide whether to believe her or burn everything down anyway, because rage is a much easier thing to hold onto than grief. Amara did not flinch under his gaze. She had spent 2 years learning exactly how to sit across from this man without showing fear, and old habits apparently did not disappear just because the war was ending. "I told you the truth because you deserved it 30 years ago and never got it. Not because I wanted something from you." "Everyone wants something from me," Harin said, though there was less venom in it than the words suggested, more tired reflex than actual accusation. "I want to apologize," Madame Han said, and the words seemed to cost her every ounce of pride she'd built over a lifetime of never once admitting weakness to anyone, least of all a stranger who was, impossibly, also her son. "I was young, frightened. My father made a decision for my life the way this family has made decisions for everyone in it for generations, and I was not brave enough to fight it the way I should have. You grew up believing I chose an empire over you. I did not choose anything. It was chosen for me, and that is not an excuse, Harin. It is simply the truth, and you deserved the truth 30 years before you finally had to dig it out of a stranger's confession." The tea house fell silent except for the soft sound of tea steeping, steam curling up between 4 people who were, technically, all that remained of a family shattered before any of them had been given a say in the matter. "I spent 30 years building an empire specifically to hurt this one," Harin said finally. "Every deal, every rival alliance, every late-night meeting with your wife," he nodded toward Ji-hoon, "was designed to bring the Kong family to its knees slowly enough that you'd all understand exactly what it felt like to lose everything you thought was permanent. And then this woman sat across from me for 2 years, trading favors and secrets to protect a marriage I was actively trying to destroy, and never once asked me to stop hating her for it." "Hating me wasn't the point," Amara said quietly. "You were never actually angry at me. You were angry at a family that let a little boy grow up believing he wasn't wanted. I understood that the first time we sat down together, and I decided the debt your father wrote wasn't worth collecting in blood when the real debt was an apology nobody had the courage to offer." Harin's jaw worked, something old and raw moving behind his composed expression. "You're either the most foolish woman I've ever negotiated with, or the bravest. Can it be both?" Amara asked, and for the first time since they'd sat down, something that might have been the ghost of a smile flickered across Harin's face. Ji-hoon leaned forward, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was about to offer. A peace his father had never once considered possible, sealed not with blood or marriage as the old letter demanded, but with something far more dangerous in this family's history: honesty. I'm not here to inherit my father's war. I'm here to end it. You're my mother's son. That makes you family, whether either of us likes the arrangement or not, and this family has lost enough people to silence and pride. I'm not interested in losing a brother to it too. The word landed heavy in the small room. Brother. Harin's composure cracked for just a moment, 30 years of carefully constructed rage briefly giving way to something far younger and more vulnerable underneath. I don't know how to be anyone's brother, he admitted. I only know how to be an enemy. It's the only role this family ever gave me the script for. Then we'll write a new one, Ji-hoon said.
Slowly.
Badly, probably at first. But we'll write it. Madame Han reached across the table, her hand hovering uncertainly before Harin allowed her to take it, the first physical contact between mother and son in 30 years of hatred and hidden grief. Neither of them said anything else. Some apologies, Ji-hoon realized, watching his mother's shoulders finally lower after decades of carrying a secret too heavy for one person, didn't need more words. They just needed time and the willingness to finally stop running from them. 3 months later, the Kong estate hosted a wedding that was, by anyone's standards, considerably smaller and considerably stranger than the first one. No rival families sent passive-aggressive fruit baskets this time, mostly because Ji-hoon had made it clear that anyone who treated this reunion as gossip fodder would find their shipping routes mysteriously delayed for the foreseeable future. Madame Han stood at the front beside a guest list that now, improbably, included her estranged son, seated not as an enemy under armed watch but as family, awkward and unpracticed at the role but present, which was more than any of them had dared hope for a year earlier. Amara wore white this time, not black, and when Ji-hoon slid a ring onto her finger instead of divorce papers across a table, she laughed, the real kind, the kind with no grief hiding underneath it. Second time's the charm? She asked. Second time, Ji-hoon said, is the truth, finally, instead of a folder full of assumptions. Later, as the reception wound down and lanterns replaced chandeliers under a sky that felt considerably less judgmental than the one in Cheongdam months earlier, Ji-hoon found his mother standing near the koi pond, watching Harin attempt, with visible discomfort, to make conversation with a group of lieutenants who clearly weren't sure whether to bow to him or arrest him. You were right, Ji-hoon said, standing beside her. Silence almost cost me everything. Silence has cost this family everything, at least once a generation, for longer than either of us wants to admit, Madame Han said. I am simply glad you were brave enough to choose differently before it cost you the one person willing to bleed quietly to save you from it. Across the garden, Amara caught Ji-hoon's eye and smiled, the real one this time, no grief hiding behind it, no secrets waiting to surface and shatter everything they'd rebuilt. He crossed the distance to her without hesitation, the way he should have done every single time doubt had whispered in his ear for the past 2 years, and pulled her close. Whatever wars this family had inherited, whatever debts written in blood or silence still lingered somewhere in old letters and older wounds, Ji-hoon understood now that the only debt truly worth honoring was the one owed to the people brave enough to love you through your worst mistakes. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the empire felt less like a fortress built on fear and more like a home finally worth defending honestly.